She's frozen. She's not going to fire. Staff Sergeant Emmett Dre set it into the net with the flat certainty of a man reading a verdict, and on that black ridge in the cold, every soldier who heard it believed him. Why wouldn't they? She was small. She was quiet. She had not fired in 90 seconds, and 90 seconds is a very long time when a countdown is running, and a man below you is holding a woman in front of his chest like a shield and a threat at the same time. The tally in Dre's head said the shot could not be made. So he called it. He said the word that would end up in the report. Frozen. He was wrong about everything except the 90 seconds. Corporal Nadia Farrow was not frozen. She was counting. She was counting a gap of 11 inches between the back of a captive's shoulder and the throat of the man behind her, and she was counting the seconds until a fuel truck the enemy had demanded would roll into the wash below, because when it did, the man would turn his head to look at it, one time for less than a breath, and that single turn was the whole shot. She had already decided. She was not waiting because she was afraid. She was waiting because the moment had not arrived, and she had spent her whole life learning the difference between those two things. The report would say she froze. The helmet footage, time-stamped and pulled the next morning by a lieutenant who did not believe her either, would spend 11 honest seconds showing something else entirely. But that comes later. First, you have to understand why not one person on that ridge expected anything from the smallest soldier there, and how far the truth would travel once it got loose. If you like stories where the person everyone counted out turns out to be the only one who was ever counting right, hit subscribe because this channel lives on them. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I know where in the world you're listening tonight, driving or working or somewhere with the lights low. And stay to the end, because there's a moment near the finish, a lieutenant, a frozen screen, and 11 seconds of tape, where every wrong thing said about this woman comes apart all at once, and you do not want to hear about it secondhand. This is a true feeling story, and by the time it's done, it will have traveled a lot farther than one cold ridge. Rewind 11 weeks to a place called Outpost Harlow, a scatter of hardened tents and one stone building bolted to a shoulder of mountain where the wind came off the snowfields at night like something with a grudge. It was high country. The air was thin enough that new arrivals gasped on the walk from the pad, and cold enough that the diesel gelled and the sentries wore their breath like scarves. Harlow watched a valley road and 2 passes, and it was, everyone agreed, a nothing posting. Nothing happened at Harlow. That was the joke and the curse of it. Nadia Farrow arrived at Harlow the way she did everything, without noise. She was maybe 5'4" in her boots, narrow through the shoulders, with hands that looked too fine for the work, and eyes that never seemed to hurry. She carried her own case off the bird. She did not talk about herself. In the first week, the platoon learned 3 things about her: that she was quiet, that she was small, and that, on the range, she had missed nothing, not once. And they filed the 3rd fact under luck, because the first 2 were easier. What they didn't read, because it was in a folder and not on her face, was where the not missing came from. It came from a rented range in dry ranch country, and a woman named Junie Viro, who was very much alive and would have laughed in your face if you called her a mentor. Junie had shot bench rest and long-range competition for 30 years, won things, quit things, and taken a bored 15-year-old under her wing, mostly to have someone to argue with. Junie did not teach stillness like a monk. She taught it like a mechanic. "Slow is a choice," she used to say, tapping the bench. "It is not something that happens to you. You decide it, on purpose, every single time, and if you can't decide it, you've got no business behind a trigger." She taught Nadia to read a flag, to read grass, to read the shimmer over hot ground, and above all, to read the difference between a person who is waiting and a person who has locked up. "One of them is scared," Junie said. "The other one is the most dangerous thing on the field. Learn which you are." Nadia had learned. She did not carry a keepsake of the woman. She carried the woman's cadence in her own breathing, and a rule she said to herself like a heartbeat, and that was heavier than any object. Staff Sergeant Emmett Dre was the reason Harlow had a spine at all, and he knew it. He was the platoon's shooter, genuinely good, a big square man with a big square voice who filled a room before he entered it. Dre was not stupid, and he was not, underneath, cruel by nature. But he had decided long ago that the top of any pile had exactly one seat, and he defended his the way a man defends the last dry patch in a storm. When Pharaoh came, he looked at her once, the whole small quiet length of her, and made up his mind in about a second and a half. "They sent us a spotter and forgot the shooter," he said, in the chow tent, loud, to the table, watching her the whole time. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll find you a spotting scope and a nice log to sit on." The table laughed because you laughed at Dre's jokes. Pharaoh set down her tray, sat, ate. She did not answer. Silence, Junie always said, is a full sentence if you let it finish. "Nothing," Dre pushed. "Not even a thank you." "For the log?" Pharaoh said, and ate. It was 2 words too many for Dre, and not enough for anyone else. And the tables laughed this time went a slightly different direction, which he noticed and did not forget. The man across from Pharaoh who did not laugh was Sergeant Ammar Deeb. And if the platoon underestimated Pharaoh, it had simply stopped seeing Deeb altogether. He was older, gray coming in at the temples, a spotter who had called shots on 3 deployments and walked with the small careful economy of a man whose knees kept a running invoice. The younger soldiers thought of him as furniture. That week, Dre had told the platoon, joking but not, that command had paired the 2 leftovers on Overwatch because it kept them both out of the way. Deeb heard it because he was meant to. He just kept cleaning his glass. When Pharaoh was assigned to him, someone snorted that the retirement home had opened a second bed. Deeb found her that first night on the North Berm, alone, glassing the far passes in the dark with the kind of stillness he had seen maybe twice in his life. "You Red Wind," he said, not a question. "Since I was a kid." "Show me the far flag, West Gate," she told him without lifting her head, the direction, the speed, and the little lie the flag was telling because of the wall behind it that pushed the air up and made it red faster than it was. Deeb was quiet a long moment. "Huh," he said. And then, because he was a professional, and professionals recognize the real thing when it walks in wearing the wrong size uniform, we're going to get along. That was the whole ally bond, built where the good ones are always built, on competence and nothing softer. From then on, they worked as one instrument. He read ground and geometry. She read air and made the choice, and neither of them wasted a word explaining to the other what both already knew. The witness was a 19-year-old mechanic named Private Sal Orlin, who kept the generators alive and had never fired a shot in anger and hoped to keep it that way. Orlin liked Pharaoh because she said thank you to the people no one thanked. One afternoon, he watched her at the improvised range behind the motor pool, and what he saw stuck in him like a splinter he'd feel for years. She didn't rush. She'd settle, and go so still that the snow seemed to land slower around her. And then a paper, at 300 meters, would develop a hole in the exact center, and you'd realize the shot had already happened. Orlin didn't understand marksmanship. He understood that he was watching something most people never see and don't have a name for. "How do you do that?" he asked her once, honestly. Pharaoh looked at the target, then at him, and considered the question like it deserved a real answer, which from her it did. "I stopped being in a hurry," she said. "Everybody's always in a hurry." Orlin thought about that for weeks. He did not know it, but he was going to be the one who said, at the end, the truest thing anyone said about her. She did not yet know that in 11 weeks she would make a shot that grown professionals would call a lie to her face. She only knew Harlow was cold and quiet, and that quiet has a way of ending all at once. It ended on a Tuesday at 4:40 in the afternoon, when the light was already going amber and thin over the snow, and a patrol call sign named Copperline stopped answering. The tent flap banged. The comms specialist's voice cracked over the outpost net, stripped of its board edge for the first time in a month. "Copperline is in contact. Copperline is in contact in the lower wash. They're pinned. They've got wounded. They cannot move." And then under it, quieter, the specific dread of a young man reading a map and understanding what it meant. "They're below the east shoulder. There's no lane from the gate. Nobody down there has an angle on the high ground." Captain Devlin Ostrander came out of the ops shed pulling his gloves on, and the platoon gathered, and it was in his face before he said it. The arithmetic, and the thing the arithmetic kept landing on. To reach Copperline, someone had to hold the whole east shoulder from the one place with eyes on it. A bald knuckle of rock called the Notch, alone, in the cold and the failing light, against a force that had picked the ground on purpose. Dre was the platoon's shooter. Everyone looked at Dre. Ostrander looked at Dre, and Dre, to his credit, looked at the map hard and long, because the Notch was a bad place to die, and he was brave enough to know it and honest enough, for 1 second, to hesitate. The hesitation was 1 second too long, and Ostrander had already looked at the folder that morning, the one with Pharaoh's scores in it, the one he'd been ignoring because a staff sergeant with a loud voice had told him what to think, and it had been easier to agree. "Pharaoh," Ostrander said. The tent went still. "Sir?" Dre started. "I read her card, Emmett." Ostrander did not soften it, and it cost him, you could see it cost him, a captain admitting in front of his platoon that he'd been steering by the wrong star. "I should have read it in week 1. Pharaoh, Notch, Deeb spots. Go now." Pharaoh was already moving. She stopped only to pick up her case, and on her way past Dre, she did not gloat, did not even slow. 2 words, low, not unkind. "Watch the net." And then she was out into the cold. She keyed her radio for the first time on the way up the ridge, and the platoon, listening, heard the labels they'd hung on her fall off in real time. Not sweetheart, not the leftover. A calm, flat, unhurried voice, colder than the mountain. "Harlow, Kestrel, moving to the Notch. Deeb with me. Copperline, Kestrel, hold what you've got. I'm coming up high. 2 minutes." The climb to the Notch was 6 minutes of burning lungs done in 4. She and Deeb went up the back of the rock on hands and boots, snow to the knee in the shadow line, and came onto the flat cold shelf of the Notch just as the last real light drained out of the valley and left the long blue dark that mountains give you before true night. Below, in the lower wash, Copperline was a scatter of muzzle flash and desperation. 4 figures behind, a cut bank, one of them not moving. The enemy above and around them, in the rocks of the east shoulder. Patient, unhurried, closing. Deeb got the glass up. Pharaoh got down behind the rifle, chambered, and put her cheek to the cold stock, and everything in her went to that stillness Orlin had watched, the stillness that is not fear. "Talk to me," she said. "I count 9, maybe 11, Deeb said, glass moving. 2 in the high rocks working down the flank, left to right. They don't know you're here yet. They will. Wind. I have it," she said. "Left to right, light. It's lying near the wall. I've got it. Nearest 2 first. They're the ones about to get on top of Copperline." "Your call," she breathed. She said the rule to herself, the one in Junie's voice that lived under her pulse. Slow is a choice. She chose it. And then the mountain broke open. The first shot went out flat and hard, and the crack of it slapped off the far wall and came back doubled, and one of the 2 flankers working down toward Copperline simply stopped being a problem. Before the echo finished, she'd shifted, and the second flanker, who had turned toward the sound the way men do, went down beside the first. 2. 2, Deeb said, calm, already hunting the next. They heard that. High rocks, they're turning. Let them. The enemy in the high rocks were not fools. They read the geometry as fast as she had, understood in seconds that the equation had changed, that death had arrived from the one angle they'd left open, and they did the smart thing. They turned their fire off Copperline and onto the notch, onto her. And here is where you learn what kind of soldier Nadia Pharaoh was, because the smart move for her was to displace, and she did not, because Copperline had a man who wasn't moving, and every second the enemy shot at her was a second they didn't shoot at him. The first burst came in high and cracked off the rock a hand's width above her head, and stone chips stung her cheek, and the whole world narrowed to the cold and the crack and the count. This is the part you have to slow down, because she slowed it down. She saw the muzzle flash bloom in the high rocks, a small ugly flower of light 30 feet up and 200 out. She heard the rounds arriving before she heard them fired, that backward stitch of sound that means they're close. She felt the sting on her face, and the ice of the rock through her gloves, and the deep ache the cold was already putting in her fingers, and she filed all of it and used none of it. Her breathing did not change. Her hands did not change. Deeb, beside her, flinched. A professional's flinch, small, controlled, and still called the position. Flash, high rocks, base of the split boulder. He's dug in behind it. You've got maybe 6 inches of him when he leans. Pharaoh watched the split boulder. She did not fire at the boulder. She waited for the 6 inches, the shooter's own eagerness to bring his shoulder past the stone. And when he leaned to fire again, she was already there, and he did not lean back. 3. The second burst that had been meant for her never came. 3, said Deeb. You're a magnet now. They all know where you are. Good, Pharaoh said. Then they're not looking at Copperline. The next 20 minutes were the hardest close work Deeb had seen in 11 years, and he'd tell people so for the rest of his life. The enemy on the east shoulder were disciplined. They moved in pairs, covered each other, tried 3 separate times to flank the notch by working up the dead ground on her right, where the rock folded and hid an approach. Each time it was Deeb who saw it, Deeb the furniture, Deeb the leftover, calling the dead ground before it became a killing ground. The second time, he made a decision entirely on his own. He shifted their position 4 feet left to a lower notch that gave up some of their view of the wash but opened the dead ground fold to her. And it was the wrong-looking move that turned out to be the only right one, because 90 seconds later, 2 men came up the fold, thinking they were invisible, and learned otherwise. 4, 5. Without Deeb's 4 feet, they'd have come in behind her. She never forgot it. She made sure later that everyone knew it was his read, not hers. Sound layered over sound until the valley was an argument of them. The flat, hard bark of her rifle, the ragged answering chatter from the shoulder that hit the rocks with a different, meaner spatter, the deep cough of something heavier. The enemy brought up and fired twice before Deeb found it, and she silenced it. The endless wind, and under all of it, the small mechanical intimacies right at her cheek, the bolt riding back and forward, the click, the breath. When she transitioned to her sidearm for one bad close moment, a man who came up the near rock faster than anyone should have. The change of sound was its own event, the deep authority of the rifle giving way to the sharper, flatter, faster snap of the pistol. 3 times, and then the man was off the rock, and the rifle was back at her shoulder, as if it had never left. 6, 7, 8. 8, Deeb said. His voice had gone very quiet, the way voices do around something they've stopped being able to explain. Pharaoh, 8. She said the rule under her breath again. Not for courage, for rhythm. Slow is a choice. She made it 8 more times before the enemy on the east shoulder decided, all at once, the way a crowd decides, that the high ground had become the low ground, and this had stopped being worth it. They broke. They pulled back up the shoulder, into the rocks, dragging what they could, and the fire off Copperline died to nothing, and the wash below went suddenly, hugely silent. That silence is where the worst part of any fight lives. Pharaoh keyed her radio. Copperline, Kestrel, shoulders breaking. You still with me? Nothing. Copperline, Kestrel, give me a voice. Nothing but the wind, and the ringing in her own ears, and the 3 longest seconds of Deeb's night. 3 seconds in which the whole valley seemed to hold its breath and wait to find out whether all of it had been in time, or just barely too late. He watched her face. Her face did not move, but her thumb was white on the transmit key. Then the net crackled. Kestrel, Copperline, we're up, we're up. We've got one bad. We've got one real bad. We can't stop it. We don't. The voice broke and rebuilt itself. We need somebody who knows what they're doing. And we've got nobody. Our doc's the one who's down. Pharaoh was already off the rifle. Deeb, watch the shoulder. I'm going down. Pharaoh, watch the shoulder, she said, and went over the edge of the notch into the dark toward the wash, moving fast down ground she'd only seen through glass, because there was a man dying, and she had, in her file, under the shooting, a second thing nobody at Harlow had bothered to read. She came into the cut bank low and fast, and found them. 3 soldiers whole and shaking, and a 4th on the frozen ground with 2 of them pressing on a wound they didn't know how to hold, losing the argument. His name was Corporal Tam Ordell. He was 34 years old, and taped inside his helmet was a photograph she saw in the shine of a red lens, of a small person he would have described as the only thing he ever got completely right. Ordell was fading. She could see it, the gray coming up under the cold, the way the fight was leaking out of him faster than the blood. She did not describe the wound to herself. She did not have time for horror, and this story will not give you any either, because horror was not the point and never is. The point was her hands, the same hands that had made the split boulder pay, The same fine hands Dre had wanted to hand a log. Those hands found the artery through the layers by feel, and clamped it, and did not shake, and got the tourniquet high, and cranked it past where it hurt to where it worked, and packed and pressed and held, all in the dark, all by touch, while she talked. Ordell, look at me, not down, up here. His eyes came up, glassy, scared, a man leaving. Am I? He couldn't finish it. He tried again. I've got a kid. I've got a kid at home. Am I gonna? Yes, Pharaoh said. She did not say it gently. She said it the way you state a fact that has already been decided, which was the only way it would land and hold. You're going home. Look at me. You are going home to your kid. I've got you. I'm not letting go, and you're not leaving. And that's the whole plan. Say it back. I'm not leaving. You're not leaving. Again. Slower. I'm not leaving. There you go. Breathe with me. In. That's it. You just did the hard part. She kept her hand on his sternum, kept the pressure, kept her voice level and certain in the dark. And she stayed exactly that certain until the casualty birds came in over the shoulder 20 minutes later with light and rotor wash and people who did the rest. And she handed Ordell up, still breathing, still holding, still going home. She watched the bird lift. Deeb, coming down off the notch, found her there, and neither of them said anything. And that was the one private warm moment in the whole thing. No words, the two of them. His hand once on her shoulder, and hers up over his. And then done. Because they were both the kind of person who says the important things by not needing to. The first operation was over. Copperline was alive. The count was 8, and then it was more than 8. And by every measure, it should have been the peak of the story. The thing they'd talk about in the chow tent for a month. It was not the peak. It wasn't even close. And Nadia Pharaoh knew it wasn't over. The way you know weather. Because the enemy who'd broken off the east shoulder had not run home. They'd pulled back up the pass. And men who pull back, instead of running, are men who intend to come again with something worse. They came again 11 days later, and they came smart, and they came personal. It started as a downed bird. A resupply helicopter taking the North Pass in bad light caught something off the rocks, no one ever fully agreed what, and put down hard on a gravel bench above the wash, cracked but not burning, with a crew that walked away and a pilot who didn't walk anywhere because Warrant Officer Lisa Danner had a broken leg and could not run. And by the time Harlow understood what had happened, the enemy already had her. They didn't kill her. That was the whole cold intelligence of it. They took her, and they took the bench above the wash with its wrecked bird and its clean field of fire. And then they got on a captured radio and put Lisa Danner's voice on the outpost net, so everyone at Harlow would hear it. And behind her, a man who spoke careful, unhurried English made his demand. He wanted fuel, a specific amount, in a specific truck, driven to a specific point in the wash below the bench, alone by dark. He said what would happen to the pilot if it wasn't. And to make sure Harlow believed him, he came out onto the lip of the bench in the last light holding Danner in front of his own body, one arm across her, and in his other hand a small device the drone feed showed clearly. A length of cord, a grip, a switch under his thumb held down. A dead man's hold. Wired, the feed said, to charges under the bench and under the wrecked bird. Enough to take the whole shelf and everyone on it into the wash. If his thumb came up, it all went. If anyone rushed him, his thumb came up. He had built a machine out of one woman's body, and his own patience. And it was, Deeb said quietly, watching the feed, the ugliest smart thing he'd seen in years. Ostrander could not send men up the bench. There was no approach that didn't cross open ground, and the first boot on the gravel would be the last thing anyone did. He could not send the truck, giving them fuel, and the point was giving them everything. The clock the man had set was real and short, and the only place on the whole mountain with a line to the lip of that bench was the notch, and the only shot that solved it was a shot that had to go past Lisa Danner to the man behind her, in the dark, without touching her, without letting his thumb come up, because a hit that killed him, but let his hand open, killed everyone on the bench anyway. It was, by any honest reckoning, not a shot. It was a wish. They sent Pharaoh and Deeb back up the notch, because there was nobody else, and because Ostrander had learned finally whose card to read. And they sent Dre up too, to a second position on the shoulder, because Ostrander wanted his best shooter's eyes on it, and because, though no one said this, a part of him still could not quite believe the small, quiet woman would be the one, and wanted the loud, sure man in reach just in case. On the notch, in the dark, Pharaoh got down behind the rifle and looked at the impossible thing through her scope, and Deeb read it. And this is where the whole story turns, on what Deeb saw and Pharaoh couldn't. Because the man had made one mistake, and it was the mistake that patient, clever people make, which is that he had a plan, and plans have seams. He had demanded the fuel truck be driven to a marked point in the wash. When that truck came into the wash, and Ostrander was going to send an empty one, slow, on a timer, precisely to buy this, the man would look at it. He would have to. Everything he'd built depended on that truck, and when it rolled into view below him, he would turn his head to confirm it, one time, an instinct older than tactics. And in that turn his head and shoulder would come off the line of Danner's body and open a lane. Not a repeating lane. Not a lane that came around again. One turn. One time. Once he saw the truck and did his math, he'd square back up and never give it again. He's going to look at the truck, Deeb said, low, certain, and Pharaoh understood the whole shot in that sentence. One time, when it comes into the wash, he turns his head right. He clears her by. Deeb measured it against the geometry he'd been logging since they came up. The same 11-inch gap between shoulder and throat she'd already found. 11 inches. Maybe a full second, not 2. 1 second, Pharaoh said. 1. And then it's gone, and he squares back up, and we've got nothing. You'll have the truck's light behind him. You'll have him lit for 1 second, and then never again. Then it's 1 second, she said. And she settled in to wait for it. And this is where the report would be written, because from every other position on that mountain, what waiting looks like is nothing. What reading looks like from the outside is doing nothing at all. The truck was 3 minutes out, then 2, then 1. The man on the bench held his pose and his thumb and his hostage. Danner's voice had gone quiet. The cold came up out of the rock and into Pharaoh's hands and started stealing them, degree by degree, the thing she feared most, because a shot like this lives in the fingers, and cold fingers lie to you. She flexed them once inside the glove, slow, and went back too still. Her breathing found Junie's cadence on its own. On the shoulder, 400 meters left, Dre watched her through his own glass, watched her not fire, watched the seconds bleed, and the old certainty came up in him hot and loud, because Dre's whole life was built on the idea that the answer was to act, now first. And here was this small, quiet woman, doing nothing while a clock ran. "She's frozen," Dre said into the net. "She's not going to fire." And Ostrander, in the ops shed, heard it, and his stomach dropped, because Dre was the expert. Dre was the shooter. And if the shooter said frozen, the lieutenant beside Ostrander even reached for the log to write it, because that is how a lie becomes a record, one certain voice at a time. Pharaoh heard it too. It came right into her ear on the net. The word, the verdict, in front of everyone. She did not answer it. She had 2 words she could have said, and she didn't spend them, because the truck was coming into the wash, and the whole world had narrowed to 11 inches and 1 second, and she was not going to give any of it to Dre. Then the man behind her broke, the man who couldn't do it himself. And here is the part that mattered most, because it wasn't just Pharaoh's shot. It was Dre, forced to become the last thing he ever wanted to be. Ostrander came on the net hard. "Anybody with an angle? I need a solution now." And there was a silence on the net, a real one. 3 seconds of dead air in which every soldier at Harlow understood that Dre, the great Dre, at 400 meters and a bad angle, did not have the shot and knew it. And into that silence, costing him more than any round he ever fired, Staff Sergeant Emmett Dre keyed his radio and said the thing that broke him and remade him in the same breath. "I don't have it." A pause, and you could hear the gravel of it, the thumb pressing the switch of his own pride. "Pharaoh has it. Pharaoh's the only one who has it. It's on her. One life on the bench, and the truck's people, and the crew's people. All of it's on Pharaoh." His voice dropped. He said her name one more time, quiet, and it was the quietest anyone had ever heard him. "Kestrel, it's yours. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." In the ops shed, no one moved. In the chow tent, where the platoon had gathered around the feed, no one breathed. The men who had laughed at the log joke stood very still, because the loudest man they knew had just handed the smallest soldier. They knew the whole mountain, out loud, in front of God and the net. Pharaoh said 2 words at last. "Copy. Waiting." Not frozen. Waiting. There is a whole world of difference, and it was about to be recorded in 11 honest seconds of tape. The truck came into the wash. Its light swung across the gravel and threw the man on the bench into hard relief, lit him from behind, and it happened exactly the way Deeb said it would, exactly the way a patient man's plan betrays him. The man turned his head to the right to look at the truck. His shoulder followed. The lane opened. 11 inches of night between the pilot's body and the man's throat, and behind it the switch, the thumb, the whole machine. And Nadia Pharaoh, who had been reading and not freezing, who had chosen slow on purpose the way a woman named Junie taught her a lifetime ago, took the 1 second she'd been promised and put a single round through it. You have to understand what that second contained. She had already ranged it. She had already read the wind that curled up off the wash and lied near the rock. The same lie she'd read her first night at Harlow, off a flag by the west gate. She had already found the cold in her fingers and set it aside. She had watched the truck's light come up behind him and known it would blind him for exactly as long as it lit him. When his head turned, she did not rush, because rushing was the one thing that could kill Danner, and rushing was the thing every other person on that mountain would have done. She let the 11 inches settle. She let the breath go halfway and stop the way Junie's voice in her chest told it to. And she pressed, and the rifle spoke once. One flat, hard crack rolling out over the wash, and the round crossed the lane in the time. It takes a heart to not quite finish a beat. And it took the man precisely, and it took him in the way that matters when a dead man's switch is involved, which is that his thumb never came up because the message to lift it never arrived. The grip stayed closed. The switch stayed down. The bench did not go into the wash. Lisa Danner, whole, alive, dropped where he'd held her. And the drone feed showed her hands come up over her head in the universal shape of a person who has just been let out of the ground. And the whole shelf held, and the crew held, and the people the truck represented held. And every single life the patient man had stacked into his ugly machine came out the other side, breathing because one small, quiet woman had known the difference between waiting and freezing when nobody else on the mountain did. The net was silent. Net was. Then Deeb, beside her, in a voice she'd never heard him use, said, "Clear, she's clear. Pharaoh, she's clear." And then, softer, just for the two of them, the only time in 3 deployments he ever said it, "My God." Pharaoh came off the rifle. Her hands were shaking now, finally, in the after, the way they never shook in the during. She keyed the net once. "Kestrel, threats down. Hostages up. Send the recovery." And then she put her forehead down on the cold stock for exactly 1 breath, and lifted it, and was still again. That should have been the end. It wasn't, because a shot like that runs into a wall the good ones always hit, which is that people don't believe it. Within a day, the story had spread past Harlow and turned, as it traveled, into an accusation. There were men on other outposts, men who'd never met her, who said flatly it couldn't be done. That no one threads a lane like that in the dark past a hostage on a 1-second exposure? That somebody was covering for a lucky mess? That the pilot had gotten free some other way, and the small woman was getting the credit? And there were men closer than that. A lieutenant named Prewitt, an intelligence officer down at the battalion, who had heard Dre's own voice on the net, say frozen and could not make that word fit a miracle, decided to prove the whole thing had been softer and luckier than the legend. He pulled the tape. He pulled Pharaoh's helmet footage and the drone feed both, laid them side by side, and matched them to the timestamp, meaning to show the world a woman who'd hesitated and gotten fortunate. Instead, the tape showed him the truth, and it did it in 11 seconds, and it did it to a man who did not want to see it, which is the only kind of proof that ever really lands. That the footage showed no hesitation anywhere. It showed a reticle moving. That was the thing that stopped Prewitt cold. The small, precise drift of her aim tracking the man's shoulder in the dark for the whole 90 seconds Dre had called frozen, never locked, never stalled, alive the entire time, reading. It showed her breathing, time-stamped, slow and even, the cadence of a woman entirely in command of herself. It showed the wind red in the way the reticle sat off-center against the rock, and then corrected. And it showed the last 11 seconds plain, the truck's light coming up, the man's head starting its turn, the lane opening exactly as wide and exactly as long as it had been called, and one round crossing it in the single second it existed, clean past the pilot, into the only place it could go. There was no luck on the tape. There was no freezing on the tape. There was a woman who had waited on purpose, all the way down, and then not missed. Prewitt watched it 4 times. Then he did the thing that made him better than he'd started the morning. He sent the file up the chain with a single line attached, that the after-action word, frozen, was to be struck from the record, because the footage showed something else entirely, and what it showed was the finest piece of shooting he'd reviewed in his career. The lie died the way lies die when there's tape. all at once, and everywhere, and for good. Back at Harlow, in the chow tent, the same long table, the same seat where a big man had once offered her a log. The reckoning came. And it came the way the real ones do, with no crowd summoned for it and no speech prepared. Dre waited until she was alone with her tray. He stood over her a second, and this time it was not to fill the room. His big square shoulders had come down. He tried to speak and stopped. He tried again, and the words came out broken, restarting. A man moving something heavy with the wrong muscles. I need to... He stopped, started over. What I said on the net, frozen. I meant it when I said it. That's the part I can't. That's the part that's eating me. I looked at you doing the hardest thing I've ever seen a shooter do. And I had a name for it already. And the name was wrong, and I said it anyway because I couldn't stand that it was you. His jaw worked. He looked at the table, then made himself look at her, which cost him visibly, which was the whole apology right there in the effort of it. I've been telling you who you were since the day you got here. I had it backwards. Every word of it, backwards. He didn't list the words. He didn't recite the log joke, or the sweetheart, or the spotting scope. He just stood there, humbled all the way through, and let the not listing say it. I'm sorry, for all of it. I don't know how to make that mean anything except to stop. Pharaoh looked up at him. She let the silence finish its full sentence, the way Junie taught her, and then she gave him 2 words, fresh, chosen, that cost him nothing and gave him a way to stand back up, because that was who she was. Sit down. He sat. That was all. It was everything. Captain Ostrander did the recognition without ceremony, the way it should be done, catching her on the berm 2 days later. I steered by the wrong voice for a month, Pharaoh. That's on me, and I've fixed it. He told her she'd have her own Overwatch element now, her own name on the board, Deeb as her senior spotter, whatever she needed and whoever she wanted. You don't answer to Dre. Dre answers to the board, same as everyone. Go be what your card always said you were. He didn't make a speech of it. He didn't need to. He'd already made the only statement that mattered when he read her name off a folder in a crowded tent and admitted out loud that he should have read it sooner. The count, when they finally tallied it against the tape and the recovery, came to 31 across the 2 operations. A whole, hard number, 31. And Pharaoh never once said it aloud herself, because the number was never the point, and she knew it. The point was, Copperline came home. The point was Lisa Danner went up in a bird hole. The point was one shot she didn't take a half-second early. Private Sal Orlane found her on the pad the morning she rotated a new position, and the witness who'd watched her go still behind the motor pool all those weeks ago finally said his true thing, and it was the simplest true thing anyone said in the whole story. He didn't understand marksmanship any better than he had. He understood something else now. Ordell's kid, Orland said, shy, working up to it. The one in the photo in his helmet. That kid's got a dad, because you weren't in a hurry. He swallowed. I used to think being fast was the whole thing. I watched you be slow on purpose, and it saved everybody. I'm never going to forget that, as long as I live. Pharaoh looked at him a long moment. Then she said the thematic thing, the one true thing. Not as a lesson, just as a fact. She'd finally earned the right to say out loud, in Junie's cadence, in her own voice. Everybody's in a hurry, she said. Waiting isn't freezing. Waiting is the shot. It just doesn't look like anything from the outside. She shouldered her case. Take care of the generators. She walked to the bird. She moved, and then she was still, and her eyes were level. And there was a peace in her that hadn't been there at the start. Not because she'd proven anything to the men who doubted her, but because she'd never once needed to. Somewhere far off, on another outpost, a man was still telling the story of the shot that couldn't be made. Still insisting it must have been luck. Still certain. The way the loud and the wrong are always certain. And the tape was already on his commander's screen, already turning his certainty to smoke. 11 honest seconds, proving that the smallest soldier on the coldest ridge had never frozen in her life. She never had. She'd only ever been counting and waiting and choosing slow on purpose, every single time. Exactly the way a woman named Junie taught her. She'd have no business behind a trigger if she couldn't. The engagement is complete. The record stands corrected. And the woman they said froze walked onto a helicopter with her hands finally warm and did not look back at the ridge because she already knew everything the mountain had to tell her.